I'm Jill Heinerth, full-time professional diver, filmmaker, and Suunto diving ambassador. I've been diving with Suunto computers for well over 20 years, and recently they've decided to add a new feature that I want to share with you today. I've been happily diving with the Suunto proprietary fused RGBM algorithm for a long time, but due to customer requests, Suunto has decided to offer an alternative selection in their algorithms so that people can employ the Buhlmann algorithm with gradient factors if they choose to do so, perhaps to, more closely match their rebreather controller or to fully customize their ascent if they're extremely advanced technical divers. But I think it's really important for people to understand the foundation of gradient factors and how they work. So I've called upon my dear friend, tech dive guru Steve Lewis, who is the training director for RAID, so we can have a conversation about how you can use this algorithm if you choose to do so. Thank you for joining us, and welcome. Of course, Steve and I are here today to chat about gradient factors, something new to your Suunto personal diving computer.
Gradient factors are actually one of the simplest concepts in diving to understand, really. The only trouble is that it is a topic that people have tied up in way more mystery than it deserves. Gradient factors really boil down to two things.
And all that's important to us is what those two things do. In simple terms, gradient factors control 1. How far off the bottom a diver slows or pauses her ascent during the journey back to the surface, and 2, how long the remaining ascent time takes her while remaining in a chosen envelope of conservatism.
That's the power of gradient factors, is that level of conservatism. That's what she controls, and that's what gradient factors give us ultimate control over. So, starting at the beginning, gradient factors are only used to make adjustments to the Buhlmann algorithm. They're not part of the toolkit for any of the other decompression tables, decompression algorithms, ascent strategies that are out there. It's only Buhlmann that uses gradient factors.
Point 2. Dr. Albert A. Buhlmann, 1923 to 1994, was a Swiss physician who developed the algorithm bearing his name. And his research into decompression theory is still considered among the most complete and most useful to divers.
Latest versions that he worked on, which was the ZHL16, and there were 3 iterations, A, B, and C. They're certainly the most common, the ones that you're going to run into the most, and the ones that are used in more personal dive computers than any other option. And that's, when you think about it, it's 30 years after their initial release. That's a pretty good track record.
Now we come to the part where the usual explanation you'll find on the internet drops into a labyrinth of numbers, mathematical formula, spiced with bits and pieces of the Greek alphabet, and concepts with names like perfusion limited gas exchange, an actual thing in the Buhlmann algorithm. So instead, let's stay simple.
We all know as divers, that when we submerge, when we play underwater, we have to watch 2 things. Our gas supply, obviously, and how close we are to our no decompression limit.
If we go over the NDL, our trip back to the surface needs some special considerations. If that happens, the dive becomes a staged decompression dive because we can no longer swim directly to the surface without making stops or changing gases to optimize the off-gassing process on the way up. If we ignore all that, the odds are that we'll need a trip to the recompression chamber to correct a case of decompression illness. Here's where we arrive at decompression theory. We need help from folks like Buhlmann to help us get safely home. Certainly when we plan decompression dives, but really even on those with no decompression limits.
I guess now is a good time to restate that deco theory is all about trying to model what goes on in the human body. It's pure mathematics trying to model physiology. One, a definite science with well-defined parameters, and the other, alchemy, the other with loads and loads of variables. The human body is difficult to model, and that's why no decompression theory is absolutely guaranteed to work.
However, as good as his original work is, there are slight modifications to Buhlmann's algorithm that have been tried, tested, and adopted over the years. One that's germane to any conversation about gradient factors is M values.
And the M stands for maximum. Workman's idea was that the M value defines the maximum amount of inert gas pressure a hypothetical tissue compartment can tolerate without presenting symptoms of decompression sickness.
Buhlmann's working construct was that there are 16 of these pretend compartments in a diver's body. Each has slightly different behavior, both for taking up and eliminating gas.
So the on-gassing and off-gassing process was different in each of 16 compartments. So the math works different calculations out for 16 tissue groups.
This is said to be its halftime. In case you're unfamiliar with that term, a theoretical tissue group's halftime describes the number of minutes it takes for the tissue to become half saturated with inert gas.
Let's say a halftime of a hypothetical tissue group is 5 minutes. That means after 5 minutes, it's half full of inert gas. After another 5 minutes, it's half of that again. So half, 50%, plus 25%. So now, after 2 tissue half times, it's 75% filled, 75% saturated. And that goes on for 6 half times. Theoretically, after 6 half times, that particular tissue group is saturated. It's full.
Workman modified the mathematical model in a way that accounted for each tissue group as the diver moved up the water column and the ambient pressure around her decreased. One way to look at it is that there are 16 saucepans on the stove, each containing various types of soup, thin broth to thick hearty stew, and the M value's job is to let us know which is closest to boiling over. Tracking M values gives us a chance to make sure all the lids stay in place and nothing spills on the stove. In other words, we don't get bent. And gradient factors are all about tracking M values.
You'll notice that M values consist of 2 numbers, a GF low followed by a GF high. For example, Suunto ships its computers with a default gradient factor setting of 30/70. So what that means, the keeping the lids on strategy is the high number, the 70. So that GF of 100 would be completely saturated and completely boiling over. So 70 is 30% less than that maximum value. So there's a degree of conservatism in there.
So continuing with our boiling saucepan analogy, now let's look at the GF low number. In order for the algorithm to start a hypothetical tissue group actually off-gassing to begin the decompression process, we have to warm up the contents of the 16 saucepans. The GF low number tells us how high the burner is turned up to do this. Again, the default from the factory is a setting of 30/70, so the lowest GF has the saucepan simmering away at 30% of the mathematical model. Not too hot, not too cold, nice and controlled. Of course, the saucepan analogy is far from perfect, but hopefully it draws a picture in your mind. So here's a diver on a 1090 profile They do their bottom time and first stop at 10% of the M value, and then continue, and the stops are distributed to get them back to the surface at 90% of the overall mathematical algorithm.
Speaking generally, the smaller value of the GF low setting, the deeper in the water column the algorithm will want the diver to stop her ascent or to slow her ascent. With a GF low of 30, a diver's first decompression stop is going to begin at 30% of the M value. And even a diver on an NDL dive, the GF low number will have an influence on the actual no decompression limit.
A GF low of 30 would net a shorter NDL than a GF low of 80, for instance.
Something that's used apparently by a recompression physiologist called David Dulett in an article titled Gradient Factors in a Post-Deep Stops World. He suggests that once you've selected your GF high factor, let's say 80, a GF high of 80, you calculate the GF low by multiplying your GF high by 75%. So 75% of 80 is approximately 60. So you would end up with a gradient factors of a 60-80.
We're mentioning Dulett's strategy here to point out the various approaches that different researchers take when testing the effectiveness of GFs.
We feel that making vast deviations from the default, the factory default that your computer came with, you're marching into the realm of primary decompression research. And unless you've got a hyperbaric team and a recompression chamber waiting for you on the surface, that's probably not the best way to plan your dives. So be careful.
So in closing, a few overall generalities to consider.
The smaller the GF low, the closer to the bottom the algorithm's going to call for that initial stop.
The greater the GF high, the shorter the overall run time of the dive.
A GF high, greater than 80, is considered an aggressive choice.
And 4, a GF low of less than 30 may result in an initial stop that's so close to the maximum depth that on-gassing continues. Also worth taking note of is that RAID does not make any suggestions about what is or what is not an acceptable gradient factor setting. There is simply too many individual factors.
So many variables in the human body from day to day, person to person. GF experts have identified something like 30 different factors that come into play. And we just can't go into all those. I mean, that's part of the joy of having a computer come to you with factory defaults. You can use the default.
And so our advice is to be conservative in your dive planning. Research, take notes, and plan your dive.
Only you know how you feel after a dive, and you should feel after a dive, you should feel better than you felt before it. And if you don't, then make an adjustment to those or go back to the default gradient factors. Be less aggressive. Always be less aggressive. There's a bibliography for you to do some further research, and the final message, I guess, is dive safe.